Hi there, I'm Emily Mielstein, and this is a public hearing video for Reef Fish Amendment 56, which considers modifying gag grouper catch limits, sector allocations, and recreational seasons. So unfortunately, the most recent stock assessment for gag, which is CDAR 72, was completed in 2022, and it estimated that gag is overfished and experiencing overfishing as of 2019. Now, there's a couple of important things to know about the stock assessment. First, it incorporated an ecosystem-based analysis that accounts for red tide events since 2005, and it found 4 such events. It also updated information on sexual maturity and the time that it takes gags to transition from female to male, and it found that less than 2% of the gag population is male. The assessment also converts to new recreational landings estimates, which impacts allocations and catch limits. So the Florida SURFs program is used for private recreational landings, and then the federal for hire, both the headboat and charter landings, are accounted for using the federal MRIP FES program and the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey. So we're here because the council is obligated to end overfishing. Interim measures were put into place for 2023, so for this year, but the council's Scientific and Statistical Committee has recommended some reduced catch limits and also revising the criteria used to determine the stock status, so the status determination criteria. Additionally, changes to the recreational data collection programs have to be addressed. Catch limits need to be updated into the new data currency, which is that federal MRIP FES currency. We also need to incorporate the Florida state estimates. Additionally, allocations between commercial and recreational sectors can be reconsidered to align them with new estimates of recreational harvest. So we're here to modify status determination criteria, catch limits, accountability measures, sector allocations, and the recreational fishing season, and also to establish a rebuilding plan for gag. We need to do this to make sure that we are using the best scientific information available to end overfishing of gag and rebuild the stock to a healthy level. So now I'll walk you through the 4 different actions and all of the alternatives that are being considered in the document. So we'll start with action 1, which looks at modifying status determination criteria for gag. So again, status determination criteria is the different criteria or the goalposts that we use to determine whether a stock is overfished or experiencing overfishing. Now, as we go through this, please understand that status determination criteria is one of the most complex things that we deal with. It is not intuitive, and if you're having trouble understanding it, you're not alone. We do have some resources on our website that will help you, or you can always reach out to us and we'll help walk you through it. So I'm going to sort of give it a quick overview before we jump right into the action. So first is the maximum sustainable yield, the MSY. And what that is the peak amount of yield that could ever occur without causing harm to the stock. Next, we'll move on to the maximum fishing mortality threshold, or the MFMT. Basically, this is a level of fishing that if we go over it, then we are considered to be overfishing the stock. Then we move on to the minimum stock size threshold, the MSST. Now this is a biomass, and if we go below this biomass, this amount of fish that are swimming in the ocean, then the stock is considered to be overfished. And then finally, we have our optimum yield, which is a level of harvest associated with long-term management goals, and this accounts for social and economic factors. So jumping right into the action. The results of CDAR 72 prompted the Council's Scientific Advisors, the SSC, to recommend a more conservative approach to setting maximum sustainable yield. So currently, the Council is using Fmax, which is the fishing mortality associated with the maximum yield per recruit. So you'll notice that this action only has one alternative besides the no action alternative, and that's because the best scientific information available, or the most recent stock assessment, only supports one fishing mortality alternative. And that alternative is the fishing mortality associated with 40% of spawning potential ratio. And I'll try and break that down for you. So what that means is it only supports the idea that we can allow fishing mortality that will be associated with allowing a stock to produce 40% of the eggs that it would have if it had not been fished at all. So our first alternative is that no action alternative. It would retain our current status determination criteria, which is all based on F-max, or fishing at the maximum yield per recruit. That would set the MSY, the MFMT, the MSST, and the OY all using that F-max criteria. The second alternative, which is the Council's preferred alternative, was suggested by the Council's scientific advisors, the SSC, based on the results of the most recent stock assessment, and that uses fishing mortality at 40% of SPR to set all of our status determination criteria. Now, this is a more conservative way to set status determination criteria compared to what we have been using. So now we'll move to Action 2, which considers modifying our gag catch limits, sector allocations, and the rebuilding timeline. So let's be clear here. Under all of our potential rebuilding timelines, catch limit recommendations are a large reduction from our current catch levels. The Council now has to select annual catch limits that are below the newly recommended acceptable biological catch. Also, our current allocations are set using the old MRIP CHTS data currency, and since we've updated to the new MRIP FES currency, we can consider whether or not we want to alter our current allocations. And finally, our catch limits themselves have to be updated so that they are in the same data units, which is that FES currency, that are used in the assessment. So as always, our first alternative is the no action alternative. It would retain our current catch limits and our current sector allocation, which is set at 61% recreational and 39% commercial. Our current catch limits, our OFL, ABC, and ACLs, are based on using that MSY proxy of F-max. And they are derived in part using that old data currency, the MRIP CHTS program. Now, this is not a legally viable alternative because it is not based on the best scientific information available. We do have some other options to consider, however. Now, alternative 2 would revise our catch limits based on the recommendations of the Council Scientific Advisors and CDAR 72, and it would also establish a rebuilding timeline for gag. The overfishing limit, acceptable biological catch, and annual catch limits would be based on that fishing mortality at 40% of SPR. We would set the annual catch limit equal to the acceptable biological catch. We would retain our current sector allocation percentages, so 61% recreational, 39% commercial. And our recreational annual catch limit would be informed by the Florida SURFs program for private recreational vessels and by MRIP FES and the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey for the federal for hire vessels. So we do have some sub-options here, and they all deal with the time that it's going to take to rebuild. Now, our first option, which is option 2A, is based on the minimum timeline to rebuild, which is 11 years. But what you'll notice is this does not allow any direct fishing pressure, and that the catch limits in this option do not include dead discards. So you can see our annual catch limits are set at 0. Option 2B, which is an 18-year rebuilding timeline, is set using 75% of fishing mortality associated with 40% of spawning potential ratio. And you can see the annual catch limits that are associated with that here. And finally, option 2C would set a rebuilding timeline of 22 years, which is twice the minimum time to rebuild, right? Twice that 11-year timeline. And then you can see the associated catch limits in this table. We could also consider alternative 3, which is the Council's current preferred alternative. That would revise our catch limits for gag based on CDAR 72 and establish a rebuilding timeline. Now, all of our catch levels here, our overfishing limit, acceptable biological catch, and annual catch limits would be set based on the fishing mortality associated with 40% SPR. We would set our annual catch limits equal to our acceptable biological catch. We would revise our sector allocation in this alternative and set it to 65% recreational and 35% commercial, using average landings from 1986 through 2005, but using the Florida Surf's recreational landings data for private recreational vessel fleet, and using the MRIP FES data for the for-hire and shore modes, and also the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey for headboats. The recreational annual catch limit here would be informed in the same manner, and then you'll see our rebuilding timeline options next. So our sub-options here are the same as they were in Alternative 2. First, we could use the minimum time to rebuild, which is 11 years, and that would be in the absence of any direct fishing. And you'll see that the annual catch limits here do not include dead discards. As you'll notice in this table, that sets everything at 0. We could consider option 3B, which is the council's current preferred. That would set an 18-year rebuilding timeline based on 75% of the fishing mortality associated with 40% spawning potential ratio. And here you can see the associated annual catch limits. Or we could choose option 3C, which would rebuild the stock in 22 years. And again, there is a table here to show you what the associated catch limits would be. Okay, now we move on to action 3, which considers modifying the Gulf Gag sector annual catch targets. Now, annual catch targets are catch targets that are set lower than annual catch limits to account for management uncertainty. They reduce the likelihood that an annual catch limit is exceeded and that accountability measures are triggered. So GAG is managed using annual catch targets for both commercial and recreational sectors. The use of annual catch targets is discretionary, but it's commonly used for overfished stocks. Now, the annual catch targets set in this action are dependent on the annual catch limits that are chosen in the last action, action 2. So we'll start by looking at the recreational annual catch targets. Right now, the recreational sector's annual catch target is set 10.25% below the annual catch limit. The annual catch target accounts for uncertainty associated with setting fishing season projections, which becomes increasingly difficult as the season gets shorter and shorter. Now, alternative 1 is the no action alternative. That would retain our current buffer, that 10.25% buffer, which was set using that F max proxy. And this is not a legally viable alternative. Now, the second alternative would set the recreational annual catch target 10% below the recreational annual catch limit. Now, this value was calculated using the council's ACL-ACT control rule for the years 2018 through 2021. And then our third alternative, which is the council's current preferred alternative, would set the recreational annual catch target 20% below the recreational annual catch limit. Next, we'll move on to the commercial annual catch target, which is set 8.85% below the commercial annual catch limit. This value was set using the yield at 75% of fishing mortality associated with F max, and it was done to account for the GAG that are landed using the multi-use shares in the IFQ program. Now, it's important to note, while GAG is under this rebuilding plan, GAG cannot be landed using those multi-use shares. So in addition to that buffer, there is an additional 14% buffer set between the quota and the annual catch target. This was done to account for additional commercial discards. And it results in a total buffer between the commercial quota and the commercial annual catch limit of 21.6%. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative, and it would retain the current buffer between the annual catch limit and the annual catch target. It would also retain that extra buffer between the annual catch target and the commercial quota. It's not a legally viable alternative because F max was used to calculate the buffer between the annual catch limit and annual catch target. Alternative 2 would set the commercial quota equal to the GAG ACT. And it would set the ACT 14% below commercial annual catch limit. Alternative 3, which is currently the preferred alternative, would also set the commercial quota equal to the ACT, set the ACT 5% below the annual catch limit. And this table is a comparison of the different ACLs and ACTs under the alternatives in this action as compared to what we choose for Action 2. Finally, we move on to Action 4, which considers modifying the Gulf Gag recreational fishing season and accountability measures. Since recreational annual catch limits are being reduced, the fishing season is going to have to be shortened to ensure that the annual catch limit isn't over-harvested. The Council is considering shifting the recreational season start to balance the number of days that the season is open with the need to reduce overall mortality of gags. And just a reminder, the 2023 season will open on September 1st. That was set through an interim rule. And this document is expected to be implemented for the 2024 fishing season. So in addition to modifying the recreational season opening date, this action also considers modifying the accountability measures. So currently, the gag in-season accountability measure for the recreational sector is that National Marine Fisheries Service can close the recreational sector when the annual catch limit is projected to be met. Our current postseason accountability measure is that if recreational land exceed the annual catch limit, the National Marine Fisheries Service will maintain the recreational annual catch target for the following fishing year at the level of the prior year's annual catch target, unless the best scientific information available determines that maintaining the prior year's annual catch target is unnecessary. If gag is overfished, there will be a pound-for-pound payback applied to the annual catch limit and annual catch target. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would retain our current June 1 opener, let National Marine Fisheries Service close gag when harvest is projected to reach the annual catch limit. Alternative 2 would keep that June opener, but it would shift things. The National Marine Fisheries Service would close gag harvest when it was projected to reach the annual catch target. Alternative 2, which is the Council's current preferred alternative, would shift the season opener to September 1st, and it would close it when National Marine Fisheries Service projects that the annual catch target would be met. And Alternative 4 would open the recreational fishing season on October 1st and allow NIMS to close the season when the annual catch target is projected to be met. We also sort of teased out the different postseason accountability measures here. So in our no action alternative, if recreational landings exceed the recreational ACL, National Marine Fisheries Service can maintain the recreational annual catch target the following year for the level for the previous year. It's kind of confusing. Unless the best scientific information available determines that that's not necessary. Also, if gag is overfished, there'll be a pound-for-pound payback applied to both the ACL and the ACT. Now, in alternatives 2 through 4 in this action, we would modify the accountability measures to direct that National Marine Fisheries Service prohibit harvest when the recreational ACT is projected to be met. In addition, we would remove the provision that requires National Marine Fisheries Service to maintain the prior year ACT if the ACL is exceeded in the previous year. And if gag is overfished, a pound-for-pound payback would be applied to the ACL and ACT still. And this table will show you how long we expect the recreational season to be open based on what we choose in this action if we choose alternative 2 in action 2. And this table shows us our projected season lengths under this action if we chose alternative 3 in action 2. So the Council plans to take final action on this document at its June Council meeting. We would like to hear your comments before we do that. We're also going out to a series of public hearings across the state of Florida. Please, please, please submit your comments online or email them at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org if you don't plan to attend one of those in-person meetings. Additionally, it's important to know that after this document is completed, the Council has already initiated work on a framework action that will consider modifying some of the other gag management measures like possession limits. So stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and send us your thoughts.